Crossroad Connection, where we're speaking out for those left unheard. I'm your host today. My name is Erin Zoutendam, and here in the studio with us is Curt Tofteland, the founder of Shakespeare Behind Bars. We are so happy to have you here today, Curt. This topic is close to me for a couple reasons. I obviously love working with people in prison, but I love Shakespeare too. I just have a deep and abiding love for his plays, so we're really happy to talk to you. There is so much to talk about, but for me the most important question, or the most interesting one, is just why Shakespeare?
Well, good question, and I often get that, because again, it's about breaking down barriers and helping people understand things. It's the advocacy that I do for prisons, is to help the public understand what prison really is. Same thing with Shakespeare. People think that they have to have a PhD to understand Shakespeare, and the reality is that they don't. They just need experience with it. That in Shakespeare's day, he wrote for an illiterate audience. People didn't read the plays, they went to see the plays. So it's part of the advocacy about using Shakespeare. But the reason that I use him is the only way to get to healing when someone has experienced trauma, and this goes beyond the PTSD that they give to the title that they give to often veterans of war. Any trauma that is experienced can become PTSD if indeed you don't deal with it in some way. So a lot of people in prison that I work with, of course, have been through great trauma, and they have submerged the trauma, and they don't have language for what trauma experience they had. And if you don't have language for it and you don't give voice to it, it can't heal. The only way that trauma can heal is to give it voice. So I use Shakespeare because in Shakespeare, any trauma that any human being has ever experienced, I can find in his plays. And he gives characters words for that trauma. So when the men, the women, the juveniles come to Shakespeare and they find a character that articulates their trauma and they work on the lines and they find the truth of the lines, it gives them language, Shakespeare's language, for their trauma. Eventually, what happens in a safe circle, in the safety of a circle, they begin to talk about their trauma in their own language. And in speaking in their own language, if they're artists, that language oft becomes poetry, spoken word, hip-hop, rap, songs, memoir. It expresses itself in some artistic way, but visual art. So it's because I'm trying to help the people I work with find language that I step into Shakespeare.
That's wonderful, and in some ways, mirrors my own experience with the plays. But what do you do? I can imagine even in our circumstances, you hear so much about the language is so difficult, maybe we should start changing it. So how do you start that work? I mean, I imagine there are a number of difficulties. How do you attract people who have maybe no interest in Shakespeare? And then how do you break down the text and learn to understand that?
Yeah, he wrote for an illiterate audience. He created words. This is the beginning of modern English. He has a vocabulary that, yes, isn't necessarily used today, but it's a vocabulary that is our modern English vocabulary. And so the reality is that just as you would unpack a foreign language, let's say you're studying Spanish, it's not your native tongue. You have to understand Spanish to be able to speak it. It's true of Shakespeare, is just to understand his form, his structure. Take your dictionary out, look up a word you don't understand, put it in the context of the sentence, and bingo, you begin to understand it. And this happens really quite easily if you unpack it in a way that helps them become almost word detectives. And I use this with elementary school, I use it with middle school, juveniles incarcerated, I use it with adult male and female. And it never ceases to amaze me that they quickly take to it. And then when they take to it and they find the visceral nature of his language and the truth that are in his words and the stories he's trying to tell, they just get fascinated by it and quickly begin gobbling it up. The reality is I've been doing this a very long time. Shakespeare Behind Bars is 21 years old. Prior to that, I ran Kentucky Shakespeare Festival and I was the producing artistic director since 1989. So I've been immersed in Shakespeare for a very, very long time. The reality is when I pick up one of his sonnets that I don't know, if I enter into a play that I don't know very well, if I enter into a passage in a play that I don't know very well, I have to use the same tools, that I'm sharing with them. I have to unpack what the language means and how to understand it. And as you begin to unpack, you become more and more facile with it. And what happens is the vocabulary of every participant begins to increase. I have a guy right now who has been in prison for 40-some years. He came in functionally illiterate. He is teaching himself how to read. He had another prisoner who took him under his wing and began to help him to learn to read. And he's in Shakespeare Behind Bars. And his mentor has been transferred to another prison, but he remains. Yesterday he came in and he said, Curt, I've been working on something, just he and I. He's very shy. And he pulled out Richard II's Tower speech and he started to speak it. And his reading level and his reading comprehension continues to go up. And he said, you know, I'm not as dumb as I was told I was. I'm not as dumb as I began to think I was. And you could see just in him this awakening and this opening and this understanding of the English language and this dialect and this dialogue and all of those things right there, a miracle.
Yeah, that's a beautiful story and a powerful one. What other changes do you see? Because when you talk about, you know, kind of being a word detective, I think that is a good skill for students to have. It's a good skill for communicators to have. So what other soft skills, hard skills, what kinds of things do you see coming out of this?
I'll start with creating a restorative circle of reconciliation, which is the work that I do in creating a safe place. That's the work that begins everything. To bring 25 to 30 human beings into a circle and to begin to introduce into the circle the values and virtues that each of them hold that will become our modus of operandi, our operating manifesto, which have words like compassion and empathy and unconditional love and all of the things that are in them that they look to the person that they're closest to, that they love the most and trusted the most, what value or virtue, and they put it into the center of the circle. Everyone gets to put something in. And that becomes our modus of operandi. And oftentimes what comes out of that then is telling the truth, facing your past, taking responsibility, all of the things that we hope that the corrections experience will instill in them.
Right.
Because really, corrections is about correcting behavior. I believe in correcting behavior through programs. So they face enough rules and regulations. They have enough punishment that's heaped upon them. Punishment doesn't change anybody's behavior. We all know that. There's studies that go on and on and on that say that. The only thing that really changes functional behavior is education in many different shapes and forms, not just Shakespeare Behind Bars, but all kinds of different programs. And so what happens is in this circle then, I put art, theater, and the works of William Shakespeare. That's my passion. When I train people to do restorative circles of reconciliation, to be facilitators, after they're trained in how to create the safe place, it doesn't matter what you put in. You put knitting in, you can put basket weaving in, you can put anything into that center. You can put Bible study into the middle of that center. I put art, theater, and Shakespeare because that's my passion. Art, the artist that lives within, never content, always content. Content with where he or she is, but got to go further, got to go deeper. Theater, why? Because theater is the most immediate art form that best resembles real life. But you go see a live theater event, and that is live people up on stage, communicating, telling a story, and you're a visceral, engaged part of that experience.
Right.
So that's why theater is, because it most mirrors real life. And the other is Shakespeare, which I talked about. He's able to give language to trauma. And so what begins to happen is guys that have served time, that have put masks up and built walls up to survive in prison, begin to maybe take that wall down. Because I work in a level 1. West Shoreline in Muskegon Heights is a level 1. Those guys are all getting out.
Right.
And so the reality is that how do we want them to come out? And so in this circle of trust, exploring who they are, asking 4 questions. And this is fundamentally all about our work. Who am I? What do I love? How will I live my life, knowing I will die? What is my gift to humankind? Those 4 questions, we each sit. We're not there to fix anyone else. We're there to fix ourselves. We sit and we contemplate and we begin to define, who am I? The most important question. So what begins to happen is guys that were very introverted and withdrawn, that that tool is not going to serve them when they get out. That tool is not going to serve them. So we begin to build communication skills. We begin to build a self-identity. We begin to build confidence in them. We begin to build vocabulary in them. We begin to open them up so that when they get out and they go through the myriad of challenges and difficulties that they're going to face upon getting out, they have the tools in which to deal with those, so that when they go to a job interview, they can communicate articulately, they can speak truthfully, they can look at themselves and they can look at the job and they can tell them what skills they're going to bring to that job. Well, as any employer goes, they want to hire someone like that, irregardless of the fact that, yeah, they spent some time in prison. But if prison made a difference, then who cares if they spent time in prison? If they have paid their debt to society, and if they're back out, their slate should be clean, and they should be able to begin and begin again. So it's just about basic being a human being. Really, the work that I do, I dislike enormously the word rehabilitation, which is used all the time in corrections. You cannot rehabilitate a human mind, a human heart, or a human soul. You can rehabilitate your knee if you've injured it. You can rehabilitate a car that's been in a wreck. You can't rehabilitate any of those things. When the reality is that if you really explore where they came from, you would go, well, they're simply a mirror of the block upon which they lived and grew up. In that reflection, they are being as truthful as they can. Yeah, that led them to crime because they had no other role models. They had no other mentors. They have to come to prison. Prison should make a difference. So if prison really makes a difference, then, and I talk about that a lot, about prison making a difference. You hear in the documentary the warden, Chandler, say a statement, prison should make a difference, right? He had some 70 programs at that prison where I was working. You know, Kentucky is far ahead of Michigan in programs inside of prisons. And as I said earlier, that's really what's going to make a difference. So it's about discovering who you are and how you're going to exist within those 4 questions.
Yeah, that lines up so much with a lot of the things we think about. I mean, we often say the government can't change people. It's just an abstract, concept that we have. And that really change has to come from the heart. When I watched the documentary, which I absolutely loved and I would recommend to anyone, I have it here and then we'll tell you on the screen how you can find it as well. One thing that struck me was just how deeply self-aware so many of the men that were interviewed were. And I think that doesn't line up with the stereotypical image that we see on TV or in movies where people in prison don't take any responsibility or they have a huge chip on their shoulder, and that's the picture that we're getting in. So to have another image of people who were deeply self-aware, they could talk about what they had done in terms that far surpassed maybe the average person on the street. That was really moving for me. So do you have any stories that kind of stand out, maybe people you're working with now, where you think Shakespeare made a huge difference in this life?
Yeah, people say, why do you do this work? And I say, I have an addiction issue. And they go, oh yeah, alcohol, drugs, let me see your teeth, crackhead. And once we get past that, then they say, well, what is your addiction? And I'm addicted to miracles. I've been doing this for 21 years. I've worked with hundreds and hundreds of prisoners. We have about 80 of them on the street in Kentucky that are doing well, taking care of their families, paying taxes. They've been transformed. Every day is a miracle. Every day I see a miracle. As I said earlier to the man that's teaching himself how to read, that's a miracle. When you see a light bulb go on in someone, aha moment of where they connect how their past led them down the path that led them to prison. And the only way to functionally and metaphorically change a human being is if they understand their past, if they come to terms with it, and then take responsibility for their past, and ultimately that led to the crime, and take responsibility for that, and understand it, where it came from, what circumstances were around them. And the realization has to be that they they can choose to not be the crime that society will brand them for the rest of their lives.
Right.
That's never going to change. Once a convict, always a convict. Society is very unforgiving of that.
Right.
But within that unforgivingness, if they understand and come to terms with it and take responsibility for it, guess what? They get to be who they wish to be. That's the first question. Who am I? Who do I wish to be? Who do I wish to become? Whether they're incarcerated for the rest of their life, probably work with about a dozen men in prison in Muskegon Heights that are lifers, L-I-F-E after their name, no chance to get out unless it's the sentence is commuted by the governor. But that doesn't mean they can't live a very, very full, meaningful life because they can help others in prison. You don't search for meaning, you make meaning. You make meaning right where you are. For me, making meaning is be of service to others.
Yeah, that we hear from students all the time who say, who come to a similar realization and say, there's a freedom here that I actually didn't have before I came to prison, because now I know that I am free to be the kind of person that I was created to be, and a better person than I was. We have to take a break, and I think that we're going to be able to show a clip from the documentary, which I know our viewers will love, and it will tie into some of the themes that we've been talking about. But we'll be right back, so join us then.
Unless you really needed to be redeemed or to be shown some mercy, I don't know if you can really, truly appreciate those last few lines that he said. As you from crimes with pardon to be, let your indulgence set me free. What really speaks to me is the idea that indulgence, what he calls indulgence, is actually one of the most remarkable things in the world, and that's to redeem someone, to set them free, to redeem them of what they've done.
Welcome back to Crossroad Connection. We have here in the studio with us Curt Tofteland, and he is the founder of Shakespeare Behind Bars. So we've talked a lot about the Shakespeare part, but we haven't talked quite as much about the behind bars part. And one thing that I wanted to get to was some of the challenges that you face, even logistically. So our viewers know a lot about the certain regulations, even for sending mail into prisons, which should be fairly safe. So one thing that comes out in the documentary is that with your cast, people are always getting transferred or released or that kind of thing. So how do those physical realities change and challenge the way that you put on these plays?
Well, good question, and here's how I operate, and it's why I guess I've had the fortunate ability to survive 8 or 9 wardens in the Kentucky program, and we're on our second warden here. He's an acting warden right now in Muskegon Heights, and that is that I understand I'm a guest in their house. So as a guest in their house, what I want to know is, tell me the rules and regulations that you feel are extremely important and how those are going to change with a new administration or change within an administration. Just tell me what the rules and regulations are so that I can be a good guest in your house. So I'm there because I'm a volunteer. I'm not sanctioned by the state. I'm not presenting that kind of a program. As coming into their house, it's my job to comprehend what it is that is in the present moment. So I don't talk about what we got to do with the last administration or what we got to do yesterday. It's just tell me where we are right now and how you want to me to function and how we can best work out an ability, because really all I care about is getting in to be in the circles. And I have 8 circles going in Muskegon Heights, 5 of them in Brooks, which is a level 2, level 4, and 3 of them going in West Shoreline, which is a level 1. So it's all about adaptability. I just don't think any challenge cannot be met and solved. And really, the challenge is, I keep telling the prisoners this when things change, is I said, well, guess what? In here you're going 20 miles an hour. When you get to the street, it's 80 miles an hour. So you're going to have to learn and gain the tool about functioning when things don't go your way, or the past disappears, or you get this kind of a challenge. You know, nothing is insurmountable. What we do in the center of the circle is when we have a challenge, somebody has a gift in the circle that has a solution for us. I don't have all of the solutions, but I know somebody sitting in that circle has a solution. So it's about engaging them and calling their gift forth, because that will solve the problem. So really, you know, the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune that Hamlet talks about, slings and arrows of outrageous fortune hit every one of us all the time. And if they're really going to make it on the street, then they're going to have to learn how to adapt. I use the analogy of asking a question, would you prefer to be an oak, or would you prefer to be a willow? Well, most of the men say, I want to be an oak. Well, why do you want to be an oak? Because they're big and strong. And I say, well, what happens in a tornado to an oak? It gets destroyed. There's not an oak tree alive that can stand a tornado. Willows, what do? Simply bend, fold, let the big, bad tornado go by, and then they come back. So, you know, it's about being a willow. Has nothing to do with their masculinity, but everything to do with how they view the world.
Yeah, it sounds like another one of those soft skills that, you know, is so critical to not just when you get out of prison, but in prison, out of prison, wherever you are, even if you've never been to prison. So what about the challenge of having an all-male or an all-female cast? I mean, that would have been the case in Shakespeare's day, but it's very foreign to our minds now.
Yeah. I started Shakespeare Out with no intention of ever performing anything. It was really a laboratory that I was entering into. It was a path that I had been on for many years. I'd been working on the outside with some juveniles, and I had an opportunity to go to an adult prison, and I thought if I went there, I had, again, a very myopic view of what prison was. I thought everybody in it must have been a juvenile delinquent, right? Not true. But I just felt that if I went there and talked to the men and gained their confidence, they could tell me some things that might reach the kids that I was working with on the streets. And then it just grew from there. We became an independent program, and eventually, after about 1.5 years of functioning, where the men chose their own, I provided the material, but they chose their own monologues, their own sonnets, and their own scenes to do. One of them said to the circle, I'd like to do a full play. What do you think? I said, that's great. If you want to go in that direction, I will. And you know, it was a really learning process for the circle, because you know, in prison, sadly, the worst thing that you can do to degrade another male, in particular male, is to call him a very homophobic word. These men had to play these roles, and so you had to break down the barriers of thinking, well, yeah, he can play that role because he's gay. It's like, that has nothing to do with anything in this instance. And so when we did Two Gents, I told the men, before they went out, that the moment that first female character steps out on stage, and the prisoners who are watching know who that is, there's going to be an uproar, a pandemonium. I said, if you give in to that, they win. If you simply hold until they quiet themselves and don't get distracted and continue to speak the words of truth, eventually what will happen is the audience will come to you, and they will take care of those that are hooting and hollering. And it's exactly what happened. It takes enormous courage to be able to do that. And we've done that in our circle in Michigan. We've done 2 contemporary plays. We're working now on Comedy of Errors in one of the circles, and there are female characters in there. But the guys have stepped up, took the first one, the opportunity to do that, actually quite beautifully. One of our men, who has the most mellifluous, deep bass voice, played Lady Macbeth. Rehearsed the scene with another guy, and then sprung it on us. And so we have this great, interesting irony riff in that here comes this beautiful, mellifluous bass baritone voice in a female character, but we don't care, because he's working at speaking those words truthfully, and we listen to the words and we find the truth and we get engaged.
So how has this work changed the way that you personally read Shakespeare?
It changed me first and foremost as a human being, and as a human being who's an artist. It changed me as an artist, and as an artist who uses theater to express himself. It changed me as a theater artist. And then using primarily Shakespeare and being fascinated with Shakespeare for so many years, it changed the view of how I looked at Shakespeare. So it was transformational change for me. I sit in that circle not to fix anyone but myself. Fixing is not allowed. The moment someone says, you should do this, hold on. No. Tell them your story. And maybe in his story, he might find you. Your story, he might find you. And that's what we do. We sit and we tell our stories. And when a story like, I'm a Norwegian Icelandic farm kid from North Dakota. What do I know about urban violence, poverty, drugs, all of the stuff that a lot of the men that I work with came from? I don't know anything about that. I have no experience that can relate to that. But when I listen and I hear a man telling his story, I can find myself in his story through empathy. If I find my way into his story through a life experience, then that's literal. That happened to me, and that happens. But if we can't find ourselves existing in it, then we find empathy. And empathy is the cure for everything, right? If we lived in an empathetic world, there'd be no war, there'd be no poverty, right? We'd all get along. Every week I see over 200 men in 8 different circles. So, I have an enormous amount of hubris when it comes to, I just don't think of failure. And so when the warden asked me, Warden Mary Burgess asked me to create a program for 18 to 22-year-olds to reduce violence, I said, yeah, I'll do that. And then she asked me, will you go over to West Shoreline? There's too much violence over there, and will you create a circle there? And that circle went from 1 circle to 3 because we had 138 men that signed up for it. And I can only really facilitate 30 men in the circle. So that's how it grew. It grew out of request. And what we do is we simply sit and speak an I, and tell our stories and our experiences when we're ready to do that, because it's always invitation, never demand. Some men sit there for 6 months before they ever utter a word. It takes them that long to build this sense of trust, this realization that the circle really exists on unconditional love. I mean, I love these men unconditionally. I hate their crime, but I love these men. And it's important, I think, in the process of exploring what love is, because many of the guys, when we dig into this, they go, hey guys, I don't know what love is. I had never experienced that in my life. I know what hate is, but I don't know what love is. I thought I did, but I don't. Is to help them understand that if they mess up, which they do, sometimes they get on sanctions within the prison for doing something they shouldn't have done, they get a ticket. So when they come back because so much of what they've experienced is that love is tied to some sort of conditional thing of, if you do this, then I will love you. If you do that, then I will love you. And ours has to be is that we love you unconditionally. Now, if you look in the scriptures, you can find in the scriptures that the prophets, Muhammad, Jesus, what they spoke about is unconditional love for no matter what it is that you do. And I try to practice that because I believe in that profoundly. I want unconditional love. And I want within the safety and the sanctuary of love to be able to look at the darkness that's in me, to look at the darkness that I've done, to look at some of the things that I'm ashamed of that perhaps brought me as a circle member to prison. This was not my intention, but the circle actually really helps facilitate the development of love in the characters, in the human beings. And we look for that in the characters in Shakespeare, where they're loved or unloved, or where they, it doesn't make any difference.
Yeah, well, there is so much more that could be said, but sadly our time is at an end, and I think that unconditional love is about as good a place to end as we could imagine. So we are so thankful that you're here. This has been Crossroad Connection, and I hope you'll join us back next week.